Right, morning Year 11. I'm just going to do a short video introduction to your work today on the emergence of the slave trade and Britain's policy of plantation building in the Americas. Um, Before we get on with this work today, can you just make sure you've got, first of all, a bit of lined paper in front of you, okay, or your exercise book ideally, okay? Um, if you could then very quickly just pause the video here, and I'd like you to get that title and that keyword down, okay? So just pause here for a second. Title: Why was piracy replaced by plantations? And then plantation definition: a large farm that usually specialises in just one cash crop, such as sugar or tobacco. Just pause here for a sec. Okay, so I should have the title and that keyword down. I will come back to this image in just a minute. Okay, I've got here 12 questions for you, but because we're doing this pre-recorded, rather than me reading each question out, okay, I'd like you just to pause the video here. You've got 12 questions. 8 of them are from stuff from last lesson, and then you've got 4 at the end, which are from previous topics to do with empire and expansion. Okay, so if you could just pause the video here and answer these 12 questions in your book or on your lined paper. Okay, guys, so you should have answered those 12 questions now. Pause the video if you haven't done that yet. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through the answers now. Okay, so first answer, the New World. Okay, so remember, after the Americas were discovered by Europeans by Columbus in 1492, the Americas was named the New World because the Old World was Africa, Asia, and Europe, the parts of the world that Europeans were aware of. So North and South America became known as the New World. Okay. Now we saw last lesson there were a few bits of technology or inventions, again, important key theme, technology, that allowed the European exploration to expand. We saw lateen sails, those triangular sails that they got from the Arabs, were one invention. We saw the astrolabe, that kind of almost compass looking thing that allowed them to navigate, particularly at night. Very important. But you could have also had compasses and cannons as well. Okay, so make sure you've got 2 of those. Right, the Spanish were mainly interested in gold. Well, that was the main resource they extracted from the Americas at first. A privateer was a pirate who had a license to raid from the monarch. Remember, monarch is the name for the king or queen. Yeah, so monarch is gender neutral. So a pirate who has a license to raid from the monarch. So they're just a pirate with a license, basically. The early privateers were used by Elizabeth to target particularly Spain's treasure fleets. If you put their colonies as well, you can have a mark for that. But the key thing was targeting the treasure fleets. Okay, so those Spanish ships that took the gold from the American colonies back to Spain. Francis Drake was the privateer who became famous for circumnavigating the globe in 1577 to 78. So those of you who watched the documentary clip last time will know that. John Hawkins in 1562 has the ignoble distinction of becoming Britain's first slave trader. So after he captured a Spanish ship full of African slaves, he then went on to sell those slaves and became Britain's first slave trader as a result. Walter Raleigh was a privateer who was famous because he became the builder of England's first colony in the New World at a place called Roanoke. So he was the first one to establish colonies. In terms of question 9, so we saw that Henry used marriages to grow the Angevin empires. Remember, he married Eleanor of Aquitaine to gain those territories of Aquitaine in southern France, but then he also used marriage alliances to his sons to grow his territories as well. So he nearly doubled the size of the Angevin Empire using a policy of marriages. Okay, King John from 1204 to 1214 was Henry's son who lost most of the Angevin territories in France, except for Gascony. He did that in wars against Philip II. Wine was the main resource grown in Gascony. So remember, when the Hundred Years' War was partly triggered by the competition between France and England for that economic resource of wine in Gascony. So a key theme again. And then we then saw that Edward III partly triggered the Hundred Years' War in 1337 through his policy of claiming that he was the rightful heir to the throne of France as well as England. Remember, we saw that image where he combined the shields, the flags of England and France at the time. Okay, so a little recap on last lesson before we look at today. So we saw, last time that the New World, these colonies in North and South America that were discovered after 1492. We saw the technology that allowed the Europeans to expand that far and then consolidate their early colonies in the New World. We then saw that the Spanish were mainly interested in gold. So they built gold mines all over South America, particularly in places like Colombia. So you can see them here panning for gold in Hispaniola in what is today the Dominican Republic. And they then took all of these gold out of these Spanish colonies and took them back across the Atlantic Ocean. Worth mentioning as well for what we're looking at today that the early Spanish conquests led to the destruction of about 90% of the indigenous population. So most of the native people were wiped out. And that was one of the reasons why there was a desire to bring in slaves to the New World to basically do the work that previously the enslaved indigenous people would have done. So there was a desire for slaves because the local population was basically wiped out by disease and extermination by the Spanish. Now, we then saw as well that there were religious reasons for the early raids of Elizabeth on the Spanish colonies, because we saw that England had become a Protestant country shortly after the Reformation. So Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, had turned England into a Protestant country. And when she took over, she was very much the target of a lot of the leading Catholic monarchs at the time, particularly Spain. And she tried to use privateers as a way of trying to weaken the Spanish. So they were like the superpower in the world at the time. So what she wanted to do was weaken them through using her sailors to basically target their treasure ships. So you guys saw that documentary last time where she unleashed those privateers on the Spanish and used it to capture their treasure fleets to try and disrupt them and gain power for England, okay? Now, just a quick recap of where we are. I remember Vanessa last time was asking, are we still doing migration? Now, remember, the paper that you do for this one, guys, is called Migration, Empires and the People, okay? Now, what we've kind of done is we taught all the migration topics at first because I think it's easier with those questions, with the essay question especially, to see the links across the migration topics than if you just do all of the topics we study in chronological order. So we basically taught all of the migration topics. Now we're going to be looking at all of the empire topics. So before you were looking at like the big themes, right? You remember economic resources, government, war, religion, technology, that led to migration in different eras. Now we're looking at the same themes, but we're thinking about them in terms of why England and Britain has expanded and contracted as an empire. Okay, so we looked at the rise and fall of the Angevin Empire already as part of this sort of subunit. We looked at the 100 Years' War, and now we're currently looking at colonialism in the Americas. So I just wanted to clear that up. Remember, it's still the same paper, but the point is now we're looking at it through the lens of empire rather than through the lens of migration. Okay. All right, going back to this image then. Now, a couple of things you might notice about this. This is a sugar plantation in Barbados in 1645. Barbados was actually England's first colony in the Caribbean. And what you've got here is this is what's called a plantation, okay? Now, plantations are basically farms, but what they do is they specialize in just one or two crops, okay? Now, those crops are called cash crops because they're mainly grown for profit rather than for food. So the reason they're called a cash crop is they're not grown to like be eaten by the people who work on, say, a farm. They're grown to basically be sold for money, okay? So sugar was the main one in the Caribbean. Tobacco was the main one at first in North America, and then later on, as we'll see, cotton replaced that. A couple of things you might notice here on this plantation. So you can see here, we've got the enslaved Africans working on the plantation. Now, they are hacking down the sugarcane. They are then taking it to the mill where it would be pressed down and then basically sort of juiced. What would then happen is the sugar juice would be boiled in big heavy vats. The liquid would be evaporated, and then what would then be left behind afterwards is the white sugary substance that we'd think of as being what sugar is. Okay, but this is what a plantation would have looked like. Worth keeping in mind, this is quite a sanitized image though, because this was painted by the son of a plantation owner, so you're probably not seeing the grimmer aspects of life on plantations, which we're very much aware of. Okay, but this gives you a rough idea about how economically it would have been managed. So what we're going to be looking at today is why Britain moved away from a policy of piracy and raiding to actually setting up plantations and colonies. Okay, so I said last lesson that in some ways the British are quite like the Vikings in that they kind of come to the Caribbean and New World first of all as raiders just to try and capture some treasure and then sort of leg it back to England. What then happens though is when they realise the opportunities in the New World, they begin to build their own settlements to compete with Spain and build plantations and actually settle down to build colonies. And then we're going to be looking at the reasons for the expansion of the slave trade, particularly after Britain began to build plantations in the New World. Okay, a little bit of background first of all, then, to the growth of the slave trade and the plantation economies. Now, there's kind of two key factors that really drive the early policy of settlement and plantation in the Americas. Now, the first one is actually, interestingly, is a religious one, which is lots of the people who left England at this time, from the sort of 17th century onwards, did so because they were fleeing religious persecution. Okay, England was run as a Protestant country, but it was all run by a nationally led church called the Church of England, and basically either Catholics or Protestants who were seen as too extreme, people who became known as Puritans because they wanted a more pure Protestant church than existed in England at that time. Lots of them were targeted by the government, and as a result, they kind of left almost as refugees because of religious persecution. Okay, so a lot of the first settlers in the Americas in the New World were actually either Puritans or Catholics because they were fleeing religious persecution back home. Okay, so again, a bit like when we looked at migration for the Huguenots, they are partly leaving England because, although they're English, they are facing religious persecution, discrimination in their homeland. That's why they take the risk of going out to the New World to start a new life, to build plantations, farms, etc. Okay. The most important reason, though, for the growth of plantations in the Americas and the Caribbean is economics. Okay, there's economic reasons why building plantations and settlements becomes very valuable to people. Now, the key thing is that they realize how much money there is to be made from cash crops. Okay, now I said already, the first plantations in the Caribbean are the most important resource that is grown is sugar. Coffee and some other things become important, but sugar is the key one in the Caribbean. The most important one in North America, in Virginia and England's first colony in North America, is tobacco. Okay, tobacco obviously we know is used to make cigarettes. Tobacco becomes a huge craze in the 17th century. It's where the obsession with smoking came from. Later on in North America, tobacco was replaced by cotton as the most important cash crop, which was obviously used in Britain's factories to make textiles. Okay, so you had these religious reasons why people had to leave, combined with this pull factor of the economic opportunities available in the Americas. Okay, now that's the reason why plantations grew. But then a separate question to that is, okay, so why did the slave trade grow as a result of that? Now, when the English first came to places like Barbados and North America, they didn't actually use enslaved Africans as their workers. They actually used what were called indentured labourers, okay? So these were people who would be given, like, say, a 10-year work contract, and the idea was, right, we'll give you a little farm. If you work for 10 years for us on this kind of plantation, at the end of it, we'll give you a little farm for yourself. So they tried to use poor white semi-enslaved people at first in the Caribbean and North America. But it didn't work. And the reason for that was, A, they couldn't get enough indentured labourers to go and do the work. But also in the tropical conditions, particularly in the Caribbean, they just died way too quickly. And it was completely uneconomical to run it that way. Now, what the English then copied from the Spanish, though, is they realised that African people were actually resistant to a lot of the tropical diseases, particularly malaria, that were killing off their own workers in the Caribbean. So enslaved Africans were useful because they didn't die in the tropical conditions in places like the Caribbean. And also because they were black, it was easier to kind of justify putting them into such horrendous conditions. So they kind of used a racist ideology to justify enslavement as well. So they began then, the English, bringing in slaves to work on these plantations all over the Americas, and huge numbers of people made money as slave traders. So there were lots of English merchants who sold slaves not just to English plantations but also to Spanish plantations, Portuguese plantations, and French plantations. So it was both that the actual English plantation owners needed African slaves, but then also for the people who became specialists in the slave trade, they made money supplying slaves to all of the colonies in the New World, not just the English ones. So this is where this horrendous slave trade grew up from originally. And sometimes what historians talk about is the development of the what's sometimes called the triangular trade, okay? Which is, if we're thinking about it as a kind of economic system, the slave trade. You can pause here and copy this definition down if it's useful. So this is what's called the slave triangle. Now, if you want to think about it roughly, and again, this is a very simplified way of explaining how the slave trade worked. What you would have happen is that English sailors would take textiles, rum, manufactured goods like guns particularly, that African rulers would want. they would sail down to Africa. They would have these slave forts all on the coast of particularly West Africa, and they would basically arrive there and then trade with local African rulers for slaves. Okay, so what would normally happen is you'd have like an African state would enslave like the an enemy tribe or an enemy African state. They would then sell them into slavery, and they would trade them for these goods the Europeans would bring with them. Okay, so the ships would leave England with these goods. They would then swap them for slaves on the coast of Africa. They would then take them across to the Caribbean and North America. They would then trade the slaves for the goods that were grown by the slaves that were already there. So sugar in the Caribbean, tobacco and cotton in North America particularly. They would then take those goods back to Europe, and they would sell them for a profit. Okay, so that's kind of like the wheel of commerce, as it were, that kept the whole kind of system going. Now, I'm going to upload a few clips onto YouTube in a moment, which will give you an idea of how the slave trade worked in Western Africa. One of the clips is by David Olusoga. It describes this the slave factory of Bunts Island. So this is one of the islands where Africans would be taken in chains to await their extraction over to the colonies in the New World. Now, the slave trade had an enormous impact on Britain. Now, I'm going to sort of divide it up into economic and social and political impacts. Okay, now the economic impact is the most important one. The first thing was that you had huge companies that made enormous amounts of money. So, for example, the Royal African Company was established by the King of England at the time, Charles II, made huge profits from enslaved Africans being sold into the New World. Huge money was obviously made by the shipbuilders. So all the ships that had to be built in order to carry the slaves, the people who built the ships made enormous profits. Likewise, British banks were massively profiting from the slave trade, particularly from insuring slave ships and lending money to the slave traders and plantation owners. Barclays Bank and Lloyds Bank particularly made huge amounts of their early profits from the slave trade. The docks, okay, so remember when the produce arrived from the New World, there were huge docks built to facilitate that trade. So places like London's East End. So if you've ever been to either the West Docklands or the East Docklands in Canary Wharf, that was originally built with slave trade money. But also places like Bristol, Liverpool, their docks were largely built from the profits of the slave trade. The slave traders themselves made a huge amount of money. People who were textile factory owners made money as well, because obviously what the slave trade allowed was the importation of cheap slave-grown cotton. So textiles massively benefited from the slave trade as well. And then there were obviously the plantation owners themselves. So lots of people in Britain owned plantations in the New World, and they made huge profits from that. Now, besides the economic impacts, there were also social impacts. So a lot of cities in England actually wouldn't have emerged without the slave trade, because so much of their early business was built upon the profits of the slave trade. So particularly Bristol and Liverpool, most famously, huge slave trading cities, right? Their docklands were built from the profits of the slave trade. But also even in places like London and Glasgow, the East End of London, a huge part of East London's early development was based upon profits from the slave trade. There are buildings all over England to this day which can date their kind of building and profit, and they were built using the profits of the slave trade, I should say. So, for example, the National Portrait Gallery, which I'm sure a lot of you have been to, that was built off the backs of the profits from slavery. Politically as well, one of the reasons why the slave trade went on for so long was because a huge number of politicians had a personal investment in the slave trade. Okay, so in the 1790s, when the slave trade was being debated, 15% of the MPs either owned plantations or had shares in slave trading companies. Okay, so a huge impact on politics as well. But probably the most important social impact of the slave trade was it led to the development of racist ideas. So in order to justify the slave trade to some extent, they had to develop a set of ideas to justify it. So if they'd seen Africans as equal to Europeans, it would have been very hard to justify enslaving Africans and bring into the New World. So a whole system of kind of racist ideas was developed in order to make slavery seem acceptable. Attitudes towards Africans were quite different before the slave trade. So that was a huge long-term impact. It led to the development of racist ideologies which hadn't existed in the same way before the slave trade, and that has an impact up until this day in lots of ways. Okay. All right, guys. Now, all I want you to start off with is I've got a few comprehension questions which I've just uploaded into the tasks in Teams. I just want you to answer them using the story here. Okay. I'm then just going to set you a couple of the thinking tasks to do. And then after that, all I want you to do is watch a few clips, which I'm going to upload and put in a playlist just below this one. Okay. But if you just start off with answering those comprehension questions, and then those videos will be up very shortly. Okay. Thank you very much.